The dust storm had been raging for 3 days when Tabitha Dawson first spotted the lone rider on the horizon, a silhouette against the amber sky that promised either salvation or danger in the Wyoming Territory of 1876. The difference was often just a matter of perspective. Her shoulders ached from the strain of trying to salvage what remained of her father's homestead after the spring flood had washed away half their land and all of their hope. She'd buried him 2 months ago, and with him went her last connection to a world where a woman wasn't expected to tame the wilderness alone. Tabitha wiped the sweat from her brow, leaving a streak of mud across her sunburned face as she watched the rider approach. Her hand moved instinctively to the rifle leaning against the half-built fence. A woman alone couldn't be too careful in these parts. The weight of her father's pocket watch pressed against her hip, the last reminder of the promise she'd made to him. "This land is our future, Tabby," he'd said with his dying breath. "Don't let anyone take it from you." She'd nodded, fighting back tears, refusing to let him see her fear. The rider drew closer, and Tabitha could make out broad shoulders beneath a worn leather duster, a Stetson pulled low over his eyes. His horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, moved with the easy grace of an animal well cared for despite the harsh conditions. The man rode tall in the saddle, confident in a way that spoke of years spent navigating the untamed frontier. "Afternoon, madam," he called out when he was within earshot, his voice carrying over the wind. He reined his horse to a stop several yards away, respectful of her space and the rifle at her side. "Clay Xavier's the name. Seems you've got yourself quite the project here." Tabitha didn't lower her rifle, though she didn't raise it either. Her eyes narrowed against the setting sun. "Just passing through, Mr. Xavier," he smiled, and even from a distance she could see the creases around his eyes, the mark of a man who'd spent his life squinting into the western sun. "Was headed to Timber Creek, but this storm's brewing something fierce. Thought I might offer my services before it hits properly." Tabitha glanced at the darkening sky, then back at the broken fence line she'd been struggling with since dawn. Pride warred with practicality in her chest. "I appreciate the thought, but I manage just fine on my own." Clay Xavier tipped his hat back slightly, revealing eyes the color of a summer storm. "No doubt about that, madam, but even the sturdiest oak needs rain sometimes." "I'm not looking for charity," she replied, her voice sharp as the wind picked up around them, whipping her skirts against her legs and loosening strands of copper hair from beneath her bonnet. He dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "She was too proud to ask for help," he said, almost to himself, then looked her straight in the eye. "Then let me offer without asking." Something about the quiet sincerity in his voice made Tabitha pause. She'd turned away a dozen men in the months since her father's passing, some offering help with motives as transparent as glass, others simply pitying the stubborn woman who wouldn't sell her land and move to town like a sensible female should. But Clay Xavier didn't look at her with pity. There was something else in his gaze, a respect, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. "Storm's coming," he continued, gesturing toward the horizon where dark clouds were gathering. "Those fence posts won't hold in this soil without proper bracing. I've seen too many good homesteads washed away because the fences couldn't stand against Wyoming winds." Tabitha glanced at her work, the hours of labor that had produced little more than frustration and splinters. Her father would have known how to set the posts properly, but she'd been too young when they'd built the original fence, too busy with the household to learn all the skills she now desperately needed. "1 hour," she finally conceded, lowering her rifle but not setting it aside. "You can show me how to brace them properly, and then you'll be on your way before dark." Clay's smile was brief but genuine. Fair enough. He removed his duster and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle from years of hard work. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward her tools. Tabitha nodded stiffly, stepping back to give him space while maintaining a watchful distance. She wasn't foolish enough to trust a stranger completely, no matter how respectful he seemed. Clay worked with efficient movements, explaining as he went. "You want to dig the hole at least 3 feet deep for a fence this size," he demonstrated, his hands moving with practiced ease. "Then you need to tamp the soil around it in layers, not all at once. That's the secret most folks miss." Despite her initial reluctance, Tabitha found herself drawn closer, watching intently as he showed her how to brace the posts against the prevailing winds. There was no condescension in his instruction, just the straightforward sharing of knowledge from one landowner to another. "Your father teach you to build fences?" she asked after a while, curiosity getting the better of her. Clay paused, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm. "My grandfather, actually. He claimed to have built the first proper fence in the Wyoming Territory, though I suspect that might have been a touch of old man's exaggeration." His smile held a hint of nostalgia. "He also taught me never to approach a lady's property without announcing myself properly, so I hope I didn't startle you earlier." "You didn't," Tabitha lied, then surprised herself by adding, "Not much anyway." As the hour passed, the darkening sky brought a drop in temperature and the first spatters of rain. Tabitha found herself working alongside Clay, passing tools and holding posts steady as he secured them. His instruction was clear and patient, never assuming she couldn't understand or wouldn't remember. "That should hold against this storm," Clay said finally, stepping back to survey their work as the rain began to fall in earnest. "Though you'll want to check it after the weather clears." Tabitha nodded, suddenly aware that the hour had long since passed and the sky had darkened considerably. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by a rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. "Mr. Xavier," she began, the words sticking in her throat. Asking for help had never come easily, even before her father's death had left her so vulnerable. "It seems the storm is moving faster than expected." Clay looked toward the horizon, then back at her, waiting. "My barn is solid," she continued, each word feeling like a concession. "Your horse would be more comfortable there than on the trail tonight." His expression remained neutral, though something flickered in his eyes. "And the rider?" Tabitha squared her shoulders. "The house has a covered porch. I can provide a blanket." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Very generous, Miss Dawson." "Tabitha," she corrected, surprising herself again. "If you're going to spend the night on my porch, you might as well use my given name." "Tabitha," he repeated, her name sounding different in his low, steady voice. "Then I insist you call me Clay." They made their way to the barn as the rain fell harder, leading his chestnut stallion between them. The animal's coat gleamed in the dim light as Clay removed the saddle and began to brush him down. "He's beautiful," Tabitha remarked, watching the care with which Clay tended to his horse. "Rusty's been my companion for 6 years now," Clay replied, running a hand along the horse's flank. "Been through blizzards, deserts, and a shootout or two together." Tabitha's gaze sharpened. "Shootouts?" Clay's expression grew more guarded. "Past life. I was a deputy marshal for a spell. Followed a different path now." "And what path is that?" He finished with Rusty before answering, making sure the horse had feed and water. "I'm heading to Timber Creek to see about purchasing land, thinking of starting a horse ranch." Tabitha considered this as they dashed through the rain to the house, Clay carrying his bedroll and saddlebags. The porch provided good shelter, with a solid roof and railings that kept most of the rain from blowing in. "Wait here," she instructed, disappearing inside before returning with a thick quilt and a lantern. "It gets cold at night, even in June." "Thank you," Clay said, taking the items with a nod. "You're very kind." Tabitha almost laughed at that. Kind wasn't a word most people would use to describe her these days. Stubborn, proud, foolhardy, those were the terms she'd overheard in town when people discussed Jebediah Dawson's daughter who refused to sell up and move somewhere suitable for a young lady. "I'll bring coffee in the morning," she said instead, pausing at her door. "The storm should pass by dawn." Clay nodded, already arranging his bedroll on the dry wooden planks of the porch. "I appreciate your hospitality, Tabitha." Something in the way he said her name made her stomach flutter in a way she hadn't felt since she was 16, and Thomas Harper had asked her to dance at the Harvest Festival. She pushed the feeling aside, nodding briskly before retreating inside and securing the door. Through the curtained window, she watched as Clay settled in for the night, his movements unhurried and deliberate. He didn't try to peek into her windows or test her lock's behaviors she'd grown wary of from previous helpful men who'd passed through. Instead, he simply arranged his makeshift bed, extinguished the lantern, and lay down, one hand resting on what she suspected was a holstered pistol. A lawman's habits died hard, it seemed. Tabitha moved away from the window, lighting a single candle to guide her through her evening routine. As she prepared for bed, she found her thoughts returning to the man on her porch, to the respectful way he'd taught her about fence posts, the gentle hands that cared for his horse, the storm-gray eyes that looked at her as a person rather than a possession to be acquired along with her land. The rain pattered against the roof, and thunder rumbled in the distance as Tabitha slipped beneath her quilt, her father's watch ticking softly on the bedside table. "Just passing through," she reminded herself as she blew out the candle. By this time tomorrow, Clay Xavier would be gone, continuing on his journey to Timber Creek, and she would return to the solitary life she'd carved out for herself. Yet as she drifted towards sleep, Tabitha couldn't help but wonder what it might be like to have someone offer help without her having to ask, not just for a fence, but for all the broken things she wasn't sure how to fix on her own. Morning arrived with the soft golden light of early summer and the persistent drip of water from eaves and tree branches. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, clean world and soil too muddy for fence building. Tabitha rose early, as was her habit, and stoked the kitchen fire before putting on coffee. Through the window, she could see Clay already awake, folding his bedroll with military precision. She smoothed her hair, suddenly conscious of her appearance in a way that irritated her. She'd never been one for vanity, even before circumstances had forced practicality upon her. Still, she found herself pinching her cheeks for color before stepping onto the porch with 2 steaming mugs. "Good morning," she offered, extending one of the mugs toward him. "You're up early." Clay accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. Old habits, always been one to rise with the sun. He took a sip, appreciation evident in his expression. "That's good coffee. Real good." "My father always said bad coffee was a sin worse than lying in church," Tabitha replied, surprising herself with the easy conversation. She leaned against the porch railing, looking out over her property. The fence they'd worked on yesterday had held against the storm, she noted with satisfaction. "Smart man, your father," Clay commented. "This was his homestead originally?" Tabitha nodded, a familiar pang of grief tightening her chest. "He claimed it after the war, said he'd seen enough of death and wanted to create something instead of destroy." She rarely spoke of her father to others, finding their sympathy more painful than helpful, but something about Clay's quiet presence made the words come easier. "How long has he been gone?" 2 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days, she answered without hesitation, then felt foolish for the precision. Pneumonia. It was quick, at least. Clay didn't offer empty platitudes or unwanted pity. He simply nodded, understanding in his eyes. My grandfather used to say that good land holds the memories of those who worked it, that every furrow and fence post carries their legacy. Tabitha blinked rapidly, turning to look out at the fields where her father had poured his sweat and dreams. I believe that, she said softly. It's why I can't leave, even though everyone says I should. A comfortable silence settled between them as they finished their coffee, the morning sun rising higher and beginning to burn off the lingering dampness. Birds called from the trees that bordered the eastern edge of her property, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. The trail to Timber Creek will be muddy today, Tabitha observed finally, not quite meeting his eyes. Might be slow going. Clay studied her for a moment before responding. I'm in no particular hurry. The land I'm looking at won't be sold until next week. Tabitha hesitated, the offer on the tip of her tongue feeling dangerous somehow. My north field needs clearing before I can plant. The storm brought down some branches. She kept her tone casual, as if it were a simple observation rather than an invitation. Could be a two-person job, Clay replied with the same careful neutrality. Especially with the ground this wet. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken understanding passing between them. This wasn't charity, it was an exchange between equals. I make a fair stew, Tabitha said, collecting his empty mug, if you were of a mind to stay for dinner. The smile that spread across Clay's face reached his eyes, crinkling the corners in a way that made something flutter in Tabitha's chest again. I've never been one to turn down a home-cooked meal, especially after a day's hard work. And just like that, the decision was made. Clay would stay another day, and Tabitha would accept his help without having to directly ask for it, a compromise that allowed her pride to remain intact while acknowledging the practical reality that some tasks were simply easier with two pairs of hands. They spent the morning clearing fallen branches from the north field, working in companionable silence punctuated by occasional conversation. Tabitha learned that Clay had served as a deputy marshal in Colorado Territory before deciding he wanted a more peaceful life. He'd saved his earnings for years, dreaming of raising horses on his own land. Why Timber Creek? She asked as they paused to rest, sharing a canteen of water. Clay wiped his brow with his bandana. Heard the valley there has good grazing land and fewer disputes than some other territories. The railroad's coming through next year, which means better access to markets. He passed the canteen back to her. And I've got no interest in getting caught up in the cattle wars brewing further south. Tabitha nodded her understanding. The tensions between cattle barons and smaller ranchers had been escalating, with violence becoming more common. Her father had worried about it spreading north before his illness had taken him. You're wise to avoid it, she agreed, though no land comes without its challenges. Speaking from experience, Clay asked, his tone gentle rather than challenging. Tabitha gestured around them. This was all wilderness when my father staked his claim. The first winter, we lived in a sod house barely bigger than your horse. The memory brought a wry smile to her face. I was 13 and thought I'd died and gone to hell, Clay chuckled. And now, she looked around at the land she'd come to love, the rolling fields, the stand of aspens that provided shade in summer, the creek that ran along the western border of her property. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else. The sincerity in her voice must have resonated with him, because his expression softened. That's how you know it's home, he said quietly. They returned to work, and Tabitha found herself watching Clay when he wasn't looking, the sure movements of his hands, the straight line of his back as he lifted heavy branches, the easy way he navigated her land as if he belonged there. It was a dangerous thought, one she quickly dismissed. By mid-afternoon, the field was cleared, and they turned their attention to the chicken coop, which had sustained damage during the storm. Clay demonstrated how to properly reinforce the corner posts, and Tabitha found herself genuinely enjoying the lessons. Unlike the patronizing instructions she'd received from others, Clay taught as one would teach a partner, assuming competence and interest rather than limitation. "You're good at explaining things," she remarked as they finished the repairs. "Ever thought of teaching?" Clay laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Can't say that I have. Most of what I know was learned through making mistakes first." "The best kind of learning," Tabitha agreed, thinking of her own hard-won knowledge, "though sometimes the lessons come at a steep price." Clay's expression grew more serious. "That they do." Something in his tone suggested personal experience with costly mistakes, but Tabitha didn't press. Everyone who survived in these territories carried their share of regrets and scars. As the sun began its descent, they made their way back to the house. Tabitha felt a strange nervousness as she invited Clay inside for the promised dinner. It had been months since anyone other than herself had sat at her table. The house suddenly seemed both too small and too large, its empty chairs a reminder of all she had lost. Clay seemed to sense her discomfort, moving with careful respect through her space. He removed his hat upon entering, hanging it on a peg by the door as if he'd done so 100 times before. "May I help with dinner preparations?" he offered, rolling his sleeves up. Tabitha almost refused out of habit but caught herself. "You can peel the potatoes," she decided, pointing to a bowl on the sideboard. "Knife's there." They worked together in the kitchen. The domestic seemed so ordinary, and yet so foreign to Tabitha's recent solitary existence that it created an ache beneath her ribs. Clay moved with surprising grace in the confined space, never crowding her yet always seeming to be exactly where needed, passing utensils before she asked or steadying a pot as she stirred. "You've done this before," she observed as he expertly sliced carrots into the stew pot. A shadow of something grief perhaps crossed his face briefly. "My wife taught me, before the fever took her." Tabitha's hand stilled on the bread she was slicing. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize it's been 6 years," Clay said, his tone gentle. "Rebecca would have been the first to tell me life goes on. She wasn't one for wallowing. She sounds like a remarkable woman." Clay's smile was tinged with nostalgia. "She was, daughter of a Boston schoolteacher who came west to start her own school. Never quite got the hang of cooking, but she could quote Shakespeare while shooting a rattlesnake at 20 paces. The image made Tabitha laugh despite the solemn topic. "I would have liked to meet her." "She would have liked you," Clay replied with such sincerity that Tabitha felt her cheeks warm. She admired people who faced life on their own terms. The conversation flowed easily after that, as they shared stories of their pasts while preparing the meal. Tabitha found herself speaking of her mother, who had died when she was still a child, and of the difficult journey west with her father. Clay told her of his years as a lawman, of the good he'd tried to do and the times he'd failed. By the time they sat down to eat, the awkwardness had disappeared, replaced by a comfortable familiarity that should have frightened Tabitha, but somehow didn't. The stew was hearty and flavorful, the bread fresh, and the company better than any Tabitha had enjoyed in longer than she could remember. "This is delicious," Clay said after his first bite. "You weren't exaggerating about your cooking skills." "One of the few useful things I learned from my aunt before we left Philadelphia," Tabitha admitted. "She was convinced I'd never find a husband if I couldn't make a proper stew." Clay's eyes crinkled with amusement. And did that concern you? The husband finding? Not particularly, Tabitha replied with a wry smile. I was more interested in reading my father's medical books than learning how to pour tea properly. A woman of unconventional interests, Clay observed, his tone appreciative rather than critical. The West needs more like you. Tabitha ducked her head slightly, unused to such straightforward praise. The West hasn't always agreed with that assessment. The West is still learning, Clay said, breaking off a piece of bread. Just like the rest of us. After dinner, they moved to the small sitting area where a modest fire warded off the evening chill. Tabitha found herself telling Clay about her plans for the farm, the crops she hoped to plant, the expansion of her small orchard, the dream of adding more livestock when funds permitted. You've thought this through carefully, he commented, as she explained her rotation system for the fields. I have to, she replied simply. There's no room for error when you're on your own. Clay nodded, understanding in his expression. It's a good plan, ambitious but realistic, and yours, she asked, for your horse ranch. His face lit up as he described his vision, the breeding program he wanted to establish, combining the stamina of Mustangs with the strength of Eastern stock. He spoke of corrals and training rings, of creating horses suited specifically for the demands of Western territories. I've been sketching out the barn design for years, he admitted, a boyish enthusiasm entering his voice. Probably revised it 100 times. You should show me sometime, Tabitha said before she could think better of it, the words implying a future connection she hadn't intended to suggest. If Clay noticed the implication, he didn't comment on it. I'd like that, he said simply. The evening stretched on, conversation flowing easily between topics both practical and personal. When Tabitha finally glanced at the clock and realized how late it had grown, she felt a strange reluctance to end the evening. You're welcome to the porch again, she offered, rising from her chair. Though I imagine the ground still quite damp. Clay stood as well, his height more noticeable in the confines of her small sitting room. I appreciate the offer, but I should probably make my way to town. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough. It's not an imposition, Tabitha said quickly, then tempered her tone. That is, it's nearly 9 o'clock, and the road to town isn't safe after dark. There's a gully that floods after heavy rain. Concern flickered across Clay's features. I wouldn't want to risk Rusty on a dangerous road. Exactly, Tabitha agreed, relieved at the practical framing of her invitation. And I have a spare room. It was my father's. The bed's made up. She hurried on before her courage could fail her. It makes more sense than sleeping on the porch when there's a perfectly good bed going unused. Clay studied her face for a long moment, and Tabitha felt herself being evaluated not in the predatory way she'd experienced from other men, but with genuine consideration for her comfort with the arrangement. If you're certain, he said finally. I'd be grateful for the bed, and I give you my word as a former lawman that you'll have nothing to fear under your roof. I never thought otherwise, Tabitha replied truthfully. Something about Clay Xavier had inspired her trust from almost the beginning, though she'd been reluctant to acknowledge it. She showed him to her father's room, a simple space with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small desk beneath the window. It's not much, she apologized, suddenly seeing the room through a stranger's eyes. It's perfect, Clay assured her, setting his saddlebags on the chest with reverent care. Thank you, Tabitha. The sound of her name in his deep voice sent that now familiar flutter through her chest again. Good night, Clay, she said, retreating to the doorway. Sleep well. You too, he replied softly. Tabitha closed the door behind her and leaned against the wall of the hallway, her heart racing for reasons she wasn't ready to examine. In less than 2 days, this man had somehow breached the careful defenses she'd built around herself since her father's death. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. In her own room, she changed into her nightgown and sat at the small vanity to brush out her hair. Her reflection showed flushed cheeks and bright eyes that she hardly recognized as her own. "Don't be foolish," she whispered to herself. "He'll be gone tomorrow." But as she slipped into bed and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving about her home, Tabitha couldn't help but wonder what it would be like if he wasn't just passing through, if Clay Xavier became a permanent fixture in her life rather than a temporary visitor. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it followed her into dreams filled with fenced pastures, running horses, and a future less solitary than the one she'd resigned herself to. Dawn broke clear and bright, the storm's aftermath leaving behind a pristine sky and air that smelled of wet earth and possibilities. Tabitha woke earlier than usual, taking extra care with her appearance before chiding herself for the vanity. Clay would be leaving today. There was no sense in pretending otherwise. When she entered the kitchen, however, she found Clay already there, stoking the fire in the stove and setting water to boil for coffee. "Hope you don't mind," he said, glancing up with a smile that made her pulse quicken. "Thought I'd make myself useful." "Not at all," she replied, moving to the pantry to gather ingredients for breakfast. "Though you're a guest, you shouldn't have to work for your keep." Clay's chuckle was warm in the morning quiet. "I've never been good at sitting idle. Besides, making coffee is hardly work." They moved around each other in the small kitchen with the same easy coordination they'd found the previous evening, preparing a simple breakfast of flapjacks and bacon. Tabitha found herself relaxing into the domestic rhythm, enjoying the shared task in a way she hadn't anticipated. "You mentioned the barn needs some repairs," Clay said as they sat down to eat. "I could take a look before I head out if you'd like." Tabitha hesitated, torn between pride and practicality. The barn roof had been leaking for weeks, and she'd been putting off the repair, unsure of her abilities with such a large project. "If it's not too much trouble," she said finally. "I've been meaning to fix it, but no explanations needed," Clay interrupted gently. "I'd be happy to help." After breakfast, they walked out to the barn together, the morning sun warming their backs. Rusty nickered a greeting from his stall, and Clay took a moment to check on his horse before turning his attention to the roof. "The problem's there," Tabitha pointed, indicating where water had stained the wooden beams. "It's worst when the rain comes from the north." Clay studied the damage with a professional eye. "Looks like the shingles have rotted in that section. We'll need to replace them and possibly some of the supporting lumber." Tabitha echoed before she could stop herself. Clay met her gaze steadily. "Unless you'd prefer I leave it to you." Tabitha thought of the weeks she'd spent worrying about the barn, knowing the damage would only worsen with each rainfall. Pride was one thing, but foolishness was another. "No," she admitted. "I could use the help." The smile Clay gave her held no triumph, just simple pleasure at being useful. "Then let's get to work." They spent the morning on the barn roof, replacing rotten shingles and reinforcing the structure. Clay showed her how to check for water damage in the support beams and how to properly seal the new shingles against future leaks. His instruction was always practical and respectful, never making her feel inadequate for what she didn't know. By midday, the repair was complete, and they climbed down from the roof, dusty and tired but satisfied with the work. Standing in the barn doorway, Tabitha looked up at the repaired section with a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in months. "Thank you," she said, turning to face Clay, "for teaching me, not just doing it for me." "You're a quick learner," he replied, his gray eyes warm with approval. "Most folks would have watched rather than worked alongside." "I've never been much for watching when there's work to be done," Tabitha admitted. "My father used to say I was born with a hammer in one hand and a book in the other." Clay laughed, the sound echoing pleasantly in the barn. "A formidable combination." They made their way back to the house for a simple midday meal, and Tabitha found herself dreading the moment when Clay would announce it was time for him to leave. The thought of returning to her solitary existence after these 2 days of companionship was more painful than she'd expected. As they washed the dishes together afterward, Clay cleared his throat, a hesitant expression crossing his features. "I should probably be heading to Timber Creek soon." Tabitha nodded, keeping her eyes on the plate she was drying. "Of course, you've been more than generous with your time already." A silence stretched between them, taut with unspoken words. "Unless," Clay said finally, his voice careful, "there might be other repairs you've been putting off." "I'd be happy to stay another day or two, if you could use the help." Tabitha looked up then, searching his face for any sign of pity or ulterior motive. She found only sincerity and something else, a warmth that mirrored the feeling growing in her own chest. "The root cellar door needs replacing," she said after a moment, "and the chicken run could use reinforcing before the next storm." Clay's smile spread slowly across his face. "Sounds like at least another day's work." "Possibly two," Tabitha agreed, her own lips curving upward despite her effort to maintain a practical demeanor. "If you're sure your business in Timber Creek can wait." "It can wait," Clay assured her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Some things are more important than land deals." The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt both new and somehow familiar, as if they'd been working side by side for years rather than days. Each morning, they rose early and shared coffee on the porch, planning the day's tasks before setting to work. Each evening, they prepared dinner together and sat by the fire, talking long into the night about their pasts, their dreams, and the vast, wild country that surrounded them. Clay told her about his time as a deputy marshal, the good he'd tried to do, and the toll it had taken on him. "I've seen too many men die over gold or cattle or just plain pride," he confessed one evening. "Started to wonder if I was making any difference at all." Tabitha understood the weight of questioning one's purpose. "Is that why you decided to raise horses instead?" He nodded, staring into the fire. "I've always had a way with them. Even as a boy, I could calm the most skittish colt. Thought maybe creating something beautiful might balance out some of the ugliness I've witnessed." "It will," Tabitha said with quiet certainty. "My father always said that growing things heals the soul." "I think raising horses would do the same." Clay's gaze shifted to her face, his expression thoughtful. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," she agreed, her voice softening with memory, "though he could be stubborn as a mule when he set his mind to something." "Seems to run in the family," Clay observed with a teasing smile. Tabitha laughed, not bothering to deny it. "Some might call it determination." "Some might," Clay agreed, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I find it admirable myself." The warmth in his voice made Tabitha's cheeks flush, and she looked away, suddenly conscious of how comfortable she'd become in his presence, how easily she'd let him into her life and her home. 2 days stretched into 3, then 4, each new task revealing another that needed attention. They replaced the root cellar door, reinforced the chicken run, and mended the corral fence that had been listing dangerously to one side. Clay showed her how to properly sharpen her tools and how to tell when wood was too water damaged to be safe for structural use. On the 5th day, they rode the boundaries of her property together, Clay on Rusty and Tabitha on her mare, Penny. It was the first time she'd ridden the full circuit since her father's death, always too busy with immediate concerns to check the far corners of her land. "Your southern fence is in good shape," Clay observed as they rode alongside it. "But that western section near the creek is going to need attention before winter." Tabitha nodded, making a mental note. "Father always said that was the troublesome stretch. The creek floods every spring and undermines the posts. We could shore it up with stone at the base," Clay suggested. "Might take a few days, but it would last longer than just replacing the wood." Tabitha glanced at him sharply, noting the casual "we" and the implication of a future that extended beyond his current stay. Clay met her gaze steadily, something unspoken passing between them. "That would be sensible," she said finally, her heart beating faster. "If you were planning to be around that long." Clay reined Rusty to a stop, turning to face her fully. "Tabitha," he began, then paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I was meant to be in Timber Creek days ago. The land I was looking at has probably been sold to someone else by now." Tabitha's stomach dropped. "I've kept you from your plans. I never intended—" "No," Clay interrupted gently. "What I'm trying to say is that I haven't gone because I don't want to." The simple admission hung in the air between them, fraught with implications neither had dared voice until now. "Why?" Tabitha asked, the word barely above a whisper. Clay's expression softened. "Because in 5 days here, I've felt more at home than I have in years of wandering. Because watching you fight for this land, seeing your determination and courage, it's made me realize what I've been looking for." "And what's that?" Tabitha's voice was steady, though her hands tightened on Penny's reins. "A place worth putting down roots," Clay answered simply. "And someone worth putting them down for." The words struck Tabitha with the force of physical contact, stealing her breath. Part of her wanted to flee from the intensity of what he was offering, from the vulnerability it would require of her. But a stronger part, the part that had lain dormant since her father's death, afraid to hope for more than mere survival, recognized the truth in his words and in her own heart. "Clay," she began, then faltered, unsure how to express the tumult of emotions his declaration had stirred. "I barely know you." "You know the parts that matter," he replied without hesitation. "And I know you. The rest, well, that's what time is for." Tabitha looked out across her land, the fields waiting to be planted, the creek glinting in the afternoon sun, the distant line of trees marking the boundary of what was hers. She'd fought so hard to keep it, to honor her father's legacy and her own dreams. The thought of sharing that fight, of not facing every challenge alone, was both terrifying and desperately appealing. "I'm not asking for promises," Clay continued when she remained silent. "Just time. Time to see if what I feel, what I think we both feel, can grow into something lasting." Tabitha met his gaze, seeing the sincerity there, the patience and respect that had characterized every interaction since they'd met. "The western fence does need fixing," she said finally, a smile tugging at her lips despite her attempt at practicality. Clay's answering smile was like the sun emerging from behind clouds. "So it does." They continued their ride, the conversation shifting to more practical matters, but something fundamental had changed between them. The possibility of a shared future hung in the air, unspoken but acknowledged. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Tabitha found the courage to voice what she'd been considering all afternoon. "The Andrews place borders mine to the north," she said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's been vacant since old Mr. Andrews passed last winter. His children moved east years ago and have no interest in working the land." Clay was silent, waiting for her to continue. "It's good land," she went on. "About 60 acres with a creek running through it and plenty of open pasture. The house needs work, but the barn is solid." She paused, gathering her courage. "It might suit your purposes, for raising horses." Clay turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. That would put me right next door. It would, Tabitha agreed, meeting his gaze steadily. Close enough to help with fences, far enough to maintain propriety. A slow smile spread across Clay's face. You've given this some thought. I'm a practical woman, Mr. Xavier, she replied, her tone serious though her eyes held a hint of mischief. And a fence built by two is stronger than one built alone. Clay reached across the space between them, his hand covering hers on the porch railing. The touch was gentle but firm, a promise in itself. I'd like to see this Andrews place, he said, if you'd be willing to show me. Tabitha turned her hand beneath his, their fingers intertwining with a rightness that eased the last of her doubts. Tomorrow, she agreed, we can ride out after breakfast. The Andrews property exceeded Clay's expectations. The house was indeed in need of repair, with a sagging porch and several broken windows, but its bones were solid. The barn, as Tabitha had promised, was in good condition, large enough to stable at least a dozen horses. Most importantly, the land itself was perfect for his purposes, rolling pastures with good grass, sheltered areas for foaling season, and the creek providing a reliable water source. The price is fair, Tabitha explained as they stood on a rise overlooking the property. Mr. Andrews' son is a banker in Boston. He just wants to be rid of it without the bother of finding a buyer himself. Clay surveyed the land with a professional eye, already envisioning corrals and training rings, fields of hay and oats to supplement his stock. It's perfect, he said finally, turning to Tabitha with undisguised enthusiasm. Better than anything I'd hoped to find in Timber Creek. Her smile held a hint of shyness that was new and endearing. I thought it might suit you. It more than suits me, Clay replied, his voice growing serious. It feels right, Tabitha, being here, planning this with you. The warmth that spread through her chest at his words was becoming familiar, but no less powerful. It feels right to me, too, she admitted quietly. They rode back to her farm in companionable silence, each lost in thoughts of what the future might hold. Clay sent a telegram to the Andrews' son that afternoon, expressing his interest in purchasing the property and requesting terms. The response came quickly. The banker was eager to sell and would accept Clay's offer without haggling. It seems I'm about to become a landowner, Clay announced when he returned from town with the news. And your neighbor. Tabitha couldn't hide her pleasure at the development, though she tried to maintain a practical demeanor. You'll have your work cut out for you, getting that house habitable before winter. I've faced worse challenges, Clay replied with confidence. And I'll have the best neighbor a man could ask for to offer advice. The transition happened with surprising swiftness. Within 2 weeks, the sale was complete, and Clay became the official owner of the Andrews property. He continued to stay at Tabitha's in the evenings, but his days were spent making his new house weathertight and planning the improvements to the barn. Tabitha found herself riding over to the Andrews, now the Xavier place, most afternoons, bringing lunch and offering suggestions about the repairs. Together, they replaced the broken windows, reinforced the porch, and patched the roof. Clay ordered lumber from town for more extensive renovations, and Tabitha introduced him to neighbors who might be willing to help with the bigger projects. The arrangement raised a few eyebrows in the community, but Tabitha found she cared less about gossip than she once had. Clay's presence in her life, his unwavering respect and support, had given her a confidence she'd been lacking since her father's death. Mrs. Peterson asked if we're courting, she told Clay one evening as they sat on her porch after a long day's work. The question had been posed with the thinly veiled disapproval that characterized many of the older woman's interactions. Clay's expression grew careful. And what did you tell her? Tabitha smiled, recalling the older woman's pinched expression. I told her that my personal affairs were none of her concern, but that you were the finest man I'd met in the territory, and that I considered myself fortunate to have you as a neighbor." A slow smile spread across Clay's face. That must have set her back on her heels. "It did," Tabitha confirmed with a touch of satisfaction. "Though she'll likely be spreading tales of my impropriety by sundown." Clay's expression grew more serious. "Would it be improper, Tabitha, if we were courting?" The directness of the question made her breath catch. They'd been dancing around this topic for weeks, their growing closeness acknowledged but undefined. "No," she said finally, meeting his gaze steadily. "It wouldn't be improper at all." The relief in Clay's expression was palpable. "I've wanted to ask properly, but I feared moving too quickly. The last thing I want is to make you uncomfortable or to damage your standing in the community." Tabitha reached for his hand, an action that had become natural over their weeks together. "My standing in this community has always been that of Jebediah Dawson's stubborn daughter who refuses to know her place. I'm not sure it can be damaged much further." Clay's fingers tightened around hers. "You're the strongest, most capable woman I've ever known, Tabitha Dawson. Any community would be fortunate to have you, whether or not they realize it." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten with emotion. "You see me differently than others do," she said softly. "I see you as you are," Clay corrected. "Others are blinded by their own expectations of what a woman should be." Tabitha thought of the years she'd spent trying to balance her father's progressive views with the community's traditional expectations, always feeling somehow inadequate in both arenas. Clay's acceptance of her exactly as she was felt like permission to finally be herself without apology. "Then yes," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We are courting, Clay Xavier, and Mrs. Peterson can make of that what she will." Clay's smile was like sunrise breaking across the plains. "In that case," he said, reaching into his pocket, "I have something for you." He withdrew a small wooden box, simply made but beautifully polished. "I've been carrying this for a week, waiting for the right moment." Tabitha accepted the box with trembling fingers, opening it to reveal a delicate silver bracelet set with small turquoise stones. "It was my mother's," Clay explained as Tabitha lifted it from the box with reverent care. "She wore it until the day she died. My father gave it to her when they decided to journey west together." "It's beautiful," Tabitha whispered, touched beyond measure by the gesture. "But Clay, this is a family heirloom. Shouldn't you save it for the woman I intend to build a life with?" he finished gently. "That's exactly what I'm doing." The words hung between them, a declaration more powerful than any formal proposal. Tabitha met his gaze, seeing in his eyes the same certainty she felt growing in her own heart. "I would be honored to wear it," she said finally, extending her wrist. Clay fastened the bracelet with careful fingers, the silver cool against her skin. When it was secure, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "Tabitha," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I know we've known each other only a short time, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I don't want to rush you, but I want you to know that my intentions are serious. When you're ready, if you're ready, I want to make this official." Tabitha looked down at the bracelet, then back up at Clay's earnest face. In the weeks since he'd ridden onto her property, he had shown her nothing but respect, kindness, and genuine partnership. He had offered help without making her feel weak for accepting it, had taught without condescension, and had seen strength in her when others saw only vulnerability. "I don't need more time to know what I want," she said quietly but firmly. "I've spent too many years being cautious, Clay. Being practical above all else. But life is short. My father's death taught me that. I don't want to waste it being afraid to reach for happiness when it's right in front of me." Clay's expression filled with such hope that it nearly took her breath away. "Are you saying, I'm saying yes?" Tabitha interrupted, her own smile blooming. "Not to a question you haven't asked yet, but to the future I can see in your eyes, to building something together, side by side, as equals." The joy that spread across Clay's face was like nothing Tabitha had ever seen, pure and unrestrained, transforming his features with its intensity. He drew her to her feet and into his arms with gentle insistence, one hand cradling her face as if she were made of precious glass. "May I?" he whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips. Tabitha nodded, her heart racing as Clay lowered his head and kissed her with exquisite gentleness. The contact was brief but perfect, a promise sealed between them as the last light of day faded into twilight. When he drew back, Tabitha saw in his eyes all the things they hadn't yet said, but both felt the wonder of finding each other, the promise of a shared future, the certainty that had grown between them in such a short time. "I should probably speak to Reverend Miller soon," Clay said, his voice husky as he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Before Mrs. Peterson convinces the entire town we're living in sin." Tabitha laughed, the sound buoyant with happiness. "Let her try. I've never much cared what anyone in town thinks, and I'm not about to start now." "Still," Clay insisted, his expression growing more serious, "I want to do right by you, Tabitha. No whispers, no scandal, just a proper wedding and a lifetime together, building something that will last." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. This was a man who cared not just for her happiness, but for her reputation and standing, who saw her not as a possession to be acquired, but as a partner to be cherished. "Very well, Mr. Xavier," she agreed, her smile softening the formality. "You may speak to Reverend Miller at your earliest convenience, though I warn you, he'll insist on at least 3 Sundays of banns being read before he'll perform any ceremony." Clay groaned good-naturedly. 3 weeks, that's an eternity." "It will give you time to make your house properly habitable," Tabitha pointed out practically. "Unless you planned for us to live in mine," Clay shook his head. "I want us to have our own place, one that belongs to both of us. I thought perhaps we could combine our properties, work them together. Your fields and my pastures would complement each other well." The proposal made perfect sense from a practical standpoint, but it was the symbolism that moved Tabitha most, the joining of their lands as a reflection of the joining of their lives. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Father always said the land would provide for us if we cared for it properly. I think he'd approve of this plan." Clay's smile was gentle. "I wish I could have met him. I'd have asked for his blessing properly." "He would have liked you," Tabitha assured him, thinking of her father's straightforward manner and strong moral code. "Though he probably would have made you prove yourself first, asked 1,000 questions, and watched how you handled his horses." "A test I would have been happy to take," Clay replied, "for a prize as valuable as his daughter's hand." Tabitha flushed at the compliment, still unused to such open admiration. "You're a silver-tongued devil, Clay Xavier." "Only speaking the truth as I see it," he countered, brushing a tender kiss across her forehead. "And the truth is, Tabitha Dawson, that meeting you was the luckiest day of my life." The weeks that followed were filled with activity, as Clay worked to make his house suitable for a bride, while simultaneously helping Tabitha prepare her farm for the approaching harvest. Word of their engagement spread quickly through the small community, met with reactions ranging from genuine congratulations to thinly veiled disapproval at the swiftness of their courtship. "Mrs. Peterson suggested we were being hasty," Tabitha told Clay one afternoon as they repaired a section of her barn. "She reminded me that her late husband courted her for 2 years before they wed." Clay handed her a nail with a wry smile. And were they blissfully happy for all their careful consideration? Tabitha laughed, recalling the notoriously contentious Peterson marriage that had been the subject of gossip for decades. I believe they argued daily from their wedding day until his passing 20 years later. There's your answer then, Clay replied, his eyes crinkling with amusement. Some things can't be determined by time alone. Reverend Miller, after a long and serious conversation with both of them, had agreed to perform the ceremony after the required reading of the banns. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in October, a date chosen for its placement after harvest, but before the worst of winter weather. Clay's house transformed rapidly under his skilled hands, and the occasional assistance of neighboring farmers who, whatever their private opinions about the speed of the courtship, recognized the value of community support. The sagging porch was rebuilt, the roof fully repaired, and the interior scrubbed clean and repainted. Tabitha contributed curtains she'd sewn from fabric purchased in town and helped select furniture from the mercantile's limited offerings. "It's coming together nicely," she observed one evening as they stood in what would soon be their sitting room. The space was simple but welcoming, with a sturdy fireplace, comfortable chairs, and shelves Clay had built to hold her books and his few treasured possessions. "It's a far cry from finished," Clay replied, his critical eye noting all that remained to be done. "But it will be warm and dry for winter, and we can continue improving it over time." Tabitha slipped her arm through his, leaning against his solid presence. "It already feels like home when we're in it together." Clay's expression softened as he looked down at her. "That's because home isn't about the walls or roof, Tabitha. It's about the people who share them." It was this understanding, this deep compatibility of values and vision that had convinced Tabitha. They weren't being hasty at all. In Clay, she'd found someone who saw the world as she did, as a place where hard work and honesty mattered more than convention, where partnerships were built on mutual respect rather than prescribed roles. The night before their wedding, they sat on Tabitha's porch for what would be the last time before she became Tabitha Xavier. The air held the crisp promise of autumn, and the stars seemed especially brilliant against the black velvet of the Wyoming sky. "Nervous?" Clay asked, his hand finding hers in the darkness. Tabitha considered the question seriously before answering. "Not about marrying you," she said truthfully, "but perhaps a little about all that comes after. Combining our lives, our properties, it's a significant change." Clay nodded, understanding in his silence. "Change always carries some uncertainty," he agreed after a moment. "But I believe in us, Tabitha, in what we can build together." "So do I," she replied, squeezing his hand. "I keep thinking about that first day when you rode up and found me struggling with the fence posts." Clay chuckled at the memory. "You looked ready to shoot me if I said the wrong thing." "I might have," Tabitha admitted with a smile. "I'd turned away so many helpful men by then, men who saw a woman alone and thought they could take advantage." "And yet you let me stay," Clay observed. "Why was that, I wonder?" Tabitha thought back to that moment, to the respectful distance Clay had kept, the way he'd offered help without demanding anything in return. "You saw me," she said simply. "Not as a helpless female or a piece of property to be acquired, but as a person doing her best with what she had." Clay's expression grew serious in the dim light from the house windows. "I saw a woman of extraordinary courage and determination," he corrected gently. "And I knew within hours that you were someone I wanted to know better, someone whose strength complemented my own rather than threatening it." The words warmed Tabitha from within, chasing away the last vestiges of uncertainty about their decision. "We make a good team, Clay Xavier." "The best," he agreed, raising her hand to his lips. "And tomorrow it becomes official." The wedding day dawned clear and cool, with just enough autumn crispness in the air to make Tabitha's cheeks flush as she prepared in her bedroom. She wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved for decades and altered slightly to fit her taller frame. The ivory silk was simple but elegant, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, a touch of Eastern refinement that seemed appropriate for this milestone. Martha Johnson, the closest thing Tabitha had to a female friend in the territory, helped arrange her hair, weaving late-blooming wildflowers into the copper strands before securing the simple veil. "You look beautiful, Tabitha," Martha said, stepping back to admire her work. "Clay Xavier is a fortunate man." "We're fortunate to have found each other," Tabitha corrected gently, smoothing the silk skirt with nervous hands. "I never expected to marry, you know. After Father died, I thought I'd spend my life alone, working the farm until I couldn't anymore." Martha smiled knowingly. "Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. James and I have been married 15 years now, and he still surprises me regularly, sometimes pleasantly, sometimes less so." The comment made Tabitha laugh, easing some of her pre-wedding tension. "I suspect Clay and I will have our share of both kinds of surprises." "That's marriage," Martha agreed pragmatically. "The trick is to face them together." The ceremony itself was held in the small whitewashed church that served the scattered community, with most of their neighbors in attendance. Tabitha had no family left to give her away, so she chose to walk the aisle alone, a decision that raised a few eyebrows but felt right to her. This wasn't about being handed from one man's protection to another's. It was about choosing to join her life with Clay's as an equal partner. When she entered the church and saw Clay waiting for her at the altar, his gray eyes warm with love and admiration, any lingering nervousness vanished. He wore a new suit purchased for the occasion, his usually unruly hair neatly combed. But it was the expression on his face that took her breath away, a mixture of awe, joy, and steadfast commitment that told her everything she needed to know. Reverend Miller conducted the service with dignified simplicity, and when it came time for their vows, both Tabitha and Clay spoke with clear, unwavering voices. They had chosen the traditional words, promises to love, honor, and cherish through whatever life might bring, finding in their ancient simplicity all they wished to pledge to one another. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend declared finally. "Mr. Xavier, you may kiss your bride." Clay's kiss was tender but firm, a perfect balance of passion and restraint appropriate for a church full of onlookers. When they turned to face their community as husband and wife for the first time, Tabitha felt a surge of joy so intense it brought tears to her eyes. The celebration afterward was held at their new home. Clay had insisted on having it ready for this purpose, wanting their first social event as a married couple to establish the house as theirs together. Neighbors brought food and drink, children played in the newly fenced yard, and even Mrs. Peterson unbent enough to compliment the curtains Tabitha had made. As the afternoon waned into evening and guests began to depart, Tabitha found a moment of quiet on the new porch with Clay at her side, his arm around her waist in a comfortable embrace. "Happy, Mrs. Xavier?" he asked, his voice low and intimate despite the remaining guests in the yard. "Exceedingly so, Mr. Xavier," she replied, leaning into his solid warmth. "Though I suspect it will take some time to get used to the new name." "We have a lifetime for that," Clay reminded her, pressing a kiss to her temple. Tabitha looked out over what was now their joint property, the fields ready for harvest, the barn where Clay would begin his horse breeding program in the spring, the house they would fill with memories in the years to come. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for in the dark days after her father's death, when survival alone had seemed challenge enough. "A lifetime," she echoed softly. "I like the sound of that." The guests eventually departed, leaving the newlyweds alone in their home for the first time. Clay closed the door behind the last well-wishers and turned to Tabitha with a smile that held equal parts tenderness and desire. "Well, wife," he said, the word new and precious between them, "here we are." Tabitha stepped into his embrace without hesitation, all the shyness she might have felt dissolved by the certainty of their connection. "Here we are indeed, husband." Their kiss held none of the restraint of the church ceremony, deepening quickly into something that expressed all the longing they'd kept carefully controlled during their courtship. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, eyes bright with desire. "I've wanted to do that properly since the first time I saw you," Clay admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Standing there with your rifle and that stubborn tilt to your chin, looking like you could take on the whole territory single-handed." Tabitha laughed softly, her hand still resting on his chest where she could feel the steady beating of his heart. "And here I thought you were being a gentleman, offering to help with my fences out of the goodness of your heart." "Oh, there was plenty of that too," Clay assured her with a grin. "But I won't deny being struck immediately by how beautiful you were, all fire and determination, with those eyes that seemed to see right through pretenses." "You weren't what I was expecting either," Tabitha confessed. "I'd grown so used to men who saw my situation as an opportunity to take advantage. You were the first to offer help without making me feel weak for accepting it." Clay's expression grew serious. "You're the strongest person I know, Tabitha Xavier. Accepting help isn't weakness, it's wisdom." The use of her new name sent a thrill through Tabitha that had nothing to do with legal contracts and everything to do with the bond. They'd formed a partnership that would see them through whatever challenges lay ahead. "I believe," she said, reaching up to loosen his tie with deliberate fingers, "that it's customary for newly wedded couples to retire early on their wedding night." The desire that flared in Clay's eyes made her feel both powerful and vulnerable at once. "A fine tradition," he agreed, his voice husky as he drew her closer. "And who are we to argue with tradition?" Later, as moonlight spilled through the curtains, Tabitha had sewn with such care. She lay in Clay's arms, her head resting on his chest while his fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. The intimacy they'd shared had been everything she'd hoped for, tender yet passionate, a physical expression of the deep connection they'd formed over the past months. "I never thought I could be this happy," she admitted softly, the darkness making confession easier. "After Father died, I was so focused on survival, on keeping the promise I made to him, that I couldn't imagine there might be more." Clay's arms tightened around her. "And now," Tabitha raised herself on one elbow to look into his face, silver in the moonlight, "now I understand that surviving isn't the same as living. You've taught me that, Clay." He reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch infinitely gentle. "We'll do both together," he promised. "Survive and live, build and grow. Everything that comes we'll face as one." "As one," Tabitha echoed, sealing the promise with a kiss before settling back into his embrace, content in a way she hadn't believed possible just months before. Outside, the Wyoming wind whistled around the corners of their home, carrying the scent of autumn and the promise of changing seasons. Within, Tabitha and Clay Xavier held each other close, their separate journeys now merged into a single path, one they would walk together through whatever lay ahead. The years that followed proved Clay's promise true. Together, they faced the challenges of building a life in the unforgiving Wyoming Territory, harsh winters, summer droughts, and the constant work of maintaining two properties now operated as one. Clay's horse breeding program flourished under his careful management, producing stock that quickly gained reputation throughout the territory for their strength and intelligence. Tabitha's fields yielded bountiful harvests most years, providing feed for their animals and crops they could sell in town for needed supplies. Their home expanded as their family grew first with the arrival of Catherine Jebediah Xavier, 2 years after their wedding, a daughter with her mother's copper hair and her father's storm-gray eyes. 3 years later came Thomas Clay Xavier, born during the worst blizzard in memory, with Clay himself delivering the child when the doctor couldn't make it through the snowdrifts. "He has your stubbornness," Clay remarked as they gazed at their newborn son, his tiny fist wrapped around his father's finger. "Couldn't wait for the doctor, had to arrive on his own terms." "Our children come by their determination honestly," Tabitha replied with tired happiness. "With us as parents, they could hardly be otherwise." The community that had once raised eyebrows at their hasty courtship now pointed to the Xavier family as an example of what hard work and partnership could achieve. Their combined property became one of the most prosperous in the territory, their home a gathering place for neighbors during times of celebration and hardship alike. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Clay surprised Tabitha with a gift that brought tears to her eyes: a carved wooden sign to hang at the entrance to their property. It read simply, "Xavier and Dawson Farm ESD, 1876. You kept my name," she said softly, tracing the letters with reverent fingers. Clay's smile held all the love and respect that had characterized their marriage from the beginning. It seemed right. This place was built on both our strengths, both our dreams. The children will always know that their mother wasn't just my wife, she was my partner in everything we've created here. Tabitha looked beyond the sign to the land. They'd nurtured together the fields ready for harvest, the pastures where Clay's horses grazed, the home they'd expanded to accommodate their growing family. In the distance, she could see Catherine helping Thomas collect eggs from the chicken coop, their laughter carrying on the morning breeze. "We've built something beautiful," she said, leaning against Clay's solid presence. "We have," he agreed, his arm slipping around her waist in a gesture as familiar and comforting as breathing. "And we're just getting started." Tabitha thought back to that day 14 years earlier, when a dust storm had brought a lone rider to her struggling homestead, a man who had seen her pride and offered help without requiring her to ask for it. How far they had come since then, how much they had created together that neither could have accomplished alone. "She was too proud to ask for help," Clay murmured against her hair, as if reading her thoughts. "So I offered without asking." Tabitha turned in his embrace, looking up into the face she had come to know better than her own, the lines at the corners of his eyes deeper now, silver threading through his dark hair, but the same steadfast strength and kindness that had first drawn her to him. "The best decision I ever made," she said, "was accepting what you offered." Their kiss was gentle, familiar yet never taken for granted, a reaffirmation of the partnership they'd built day by day, challenge by challenge, joy by joy. Around them, their land stretched fertile and productive. Their children's voices filled the morning air, and their future stretched before them rich with possibility. Together, they had created not just a farm or a family, but a legacy, one built on mutual respect, shared labor, and a love that had grown stronger with each passing year. It was more than either had dared to hope for on that dust-blown day when fate had brought them together, and it was only the beginning of all they would accomplish in the years to come.